This meeting is being recorded.
Thank you. Everybody, I'd like you to meet Kristian Gravenor. He has been reporting on the news in Montreal for decades and has developed a uniquely profound perspective on the history of Montreal's English-speaking criminal set. Talk about having friends in strange places. Of course, this gang is often referred to as the West End Gang. Kristian holds degrees in history from McGill and from Concordia and has written 2 books about Montreal. He's currently serving as a Montreal reporter for CoStar News, which is a US-based commercial real estate publication. Apparently, criminal bandits have long made a mark on Montreal to a far deeper degree than the likes of Toronto or Vancouver. Kristian plans to share some insights on the stories and patterns that emerged in the making of Montreal's crime scene in the past. He'll be referencing material from his upcoming book, Want In, You're In, the West End Gang Story. Kristian, the floor is yours. It's wonderful to have you here. And we've got about 20 minutes, 25 minutes here, and then we're going to ask you, I'm sure, a bunch of questions.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be back again. I've spoken to you a few times, and I hope I don't repeat the same stuff I said before. I've been researching this with a great passion for the last several decades, really, because it's just, you know, like they say, God made man because he likes the stories, right? So I just love a good story, and there's no better reservoir for amazing tales than the world of crime. And the actual book that I've been writing is I've got about 100 pages in on it, and there are some just amazing stories. The only issue right now is that some of the people are, you know, they're still alive, and maybe they I don't really want to irritate people, and so I've kind of got that last hurdle of getting around that. You know, the fact is, some people might be quite displeased of the material in my book, where I've kind of revealed a lot of the gang's inner secrets. But let me tell you, it's really crazy. I just want to quickly start with a background on the history of crime in Montreal. I mean, you know, as we all know, Montreal wasn't even really the city it was. You know, even up to the 1950s, places like Saint Leonard didn't even really have running water in some parts of the town. So when you think of Montreal as a sort of like big city from the start, but it really was just a cluster of buildings when you think about it. And in that sense, we had early day criminals of various ethnicities, and like, for example, the Chinese of all people were considered like bandits by a lot of people, because some of them ran some heroin dens and occasionally stole things. As Chinese have been so unfairly treated in Montreal, there was even a special tax that they would put on them for Chinese laundries, and the city of Montreal put the Chinese in jail for not paying this tax, and it was absolute utter confusion. So, you know, I have a lot of sympathy for the various ethnic groups that came to Montreal and had to endure a lot of very difficult things. They also included, of course, the Italians in the 1880s, 1890s, 1900s. They had what they call the Black Hand, which was like an extortion group, and there was very clever young people in the Jewish community who started a lot of gambling. And, you know, some of these people were brilliant. In other circumstances, they would have been, you know, CEOs and billionaires. But because the economic conditions were pretty rough back then, they were sort of, they found themselves running these gambling rings. So like, for example, the Harry Ship is the one that often comes to mind. These are guys who were very whip smart with their mathematics. They could do calculations very quickly, which is what enabled them to run these operations so well. So, you know, we had all these decades of various crimes here and there. There were the bank robberies were just through the roof. And we started seeing certain patterns of crime in terms of what we call the West End Gang. It's often considered Point St. Charles Irish, but it's really not that at all, because when you look at Point St. Charles specifically, there aren't many who came from Point St. Charles, but that's sort of the association we have. Dooney Ryan, who I'll mention in a few minutes, was defined the West End Gang as Montreal's English-speaking criminals, and that's a pretty good definition for it. You know, that's they weren't all Irish, but there was definitely a strong Irish component. So we had some of the early days of that particular demographic. the most interesting one from the early era, I would say, was Rocky Pearson. And I spoke to a guy who's in his 90s named Richard Foley, who was a safecracker who's still alive today. You should probably have him on as a guest. He's a fascinating character. He's in his 90s, and he was saying that he actually knew Rocky Pearson. I've got a big chapter on him in my book. He was a jack of all trades. This guy grew up on the plateau near Schwartz's Deli. And like, for example, I was able to parse out little weird stories. I spoke to his family as well as daughter. And I found an article about how when he was a young man, about 8 years old, he was walking around and he saw a woman screaming, and later came back and he saw a dead baby. So it was like the conclusion was that he saw this woman who had just killed her babies. This is a sort of traumatizing stuff that he was exposed to as a young man. And, Rocky Pearson eventually ended up in reform school, and he became a pretty good boxer, and he became like this incredible mastermind of all types of criminality. He had an organization that robbed banks and fixed elections and everything in between. He was all over the place. And so of course there was a big tradition of lotteries as well. Of course, we all know that lotteries were illegal. We didn't have the lotteries we have now, but yet, taxi drivers, people on the street would be selling these little lottery tickets, and it was a huge business. And Rocky Pearson wanted in on that. So what happened is the RCMP stuck a guy into his gang named Watson, and he was supposed to report to the RCMP. So Watson was Pearson's chauffeur, and he came back with the information that Rocky Pearson's new big plan is not to fix elections or do lotteries, but rather to take over the South Shore. Of course, at this time, Mayor Jean Drapeau just taken over Montreal, and was planning on making getting rid of all the gangsters. So Rocky Pearson's plan was to take it to Jacques Cartier, which was the name of that Brossard/St. Lambert municipality that we have now. So he basically started his own gangster city, Rocky Pearson, on the South Shore. And his story just doesn't get any crazier, because he was he got this friend of his, a criminal, to run for mayor. And of course, Rocky Pearson was a master at fixing elections. So back then, what you would do is you would just basically go to a tavern and you would say, "Who wants to get some work? Come over here. I'll give you $20 each." So these guys would just, a whole storm of people would come to the door, and those were the economics of the city in those days, and they would just do what they said. They, regardless if it was a crime, so they'd be intimidating voters and stuff. So Rocky Pearson was pretty sure that he could assemble his forces to get his buddy set up as the mayor of this new gangster town on the South Shore. So what happened is, eventually, after several tries, he got his guy elected. And meanwhile, he was actually organizing a lot of big bank heists. For example, I'll give you one example. He had a whole crew, and some of them would like pop these speed pills before, so they would be like real maniacs. And there was one character who was quite famous for this. Anyway, so I'll give you one example of one of the heists they pulled. They went down to one of those small towns on the South Shore, and they pulled up. It was a January day in their car, and the driver said, "No, I don't want to park in the spot. It's too icy." So they sent a guy dressed as a priest to the door. The bank had just closed minutes earlier, but they took pity on the priest and let him into the bank, even though they had closed for the day. And of course, it wasn't really a priest. It was a guy with a gun. So they robbed the place, and they came out to the car, and it was stuck in the ice. So they literally had to push the car out of the ice on their getaway. So this is one of those sort of like crazy made in Quebec only stories that you can only get here. And they drove to Rocky Pearson's place, and he divided up the money. The mayor got some, everybody got some money. So it was like brazen, crazy, out of control lunacy. This sort of that level of criminal activity was just like ingrained so deeply. The fate of Rocky Pearson was quite unbelievable as well, because what happened is one day Rocky went to his office on the South Shore. Apparently Rocky had changed over the last few months, and he had gained weight, and he was in a bad way. According to his daughter, he apparently had shot somebody to death, and he felt bad about it. The guy was apparently threatening his family. So so on this fateful day, Rocky Pearson walked into his office and were to meet all of his guys who are usually hanging around, and they killed him. His own guys killed him. So Rocky Pearson was just murdered with a hammer by his own guys. And it was like one of those incredible, insane stories. The guys were accused and put on trial, but were never convicted. However, they were convicted of a variety of other things. So in a way, people don't really know about Rocky Pearson, but he was really one of the major crime lords of the Montreal history. And I think in a way, he was actually born in Ireland. He had a very unconventional family history. So I think he probably set a tone for later gangsters. I think he died relatively young in about 1962, I think. And so we had other gangsters from that time, from the English-speaking community, were often from the same exact area, which was St. Antoine Street. If you're familiar with like Little Burgundy, as they call it, they a bunch of them sprouted from the Johnny Maguire and his brothers came from there. They eventually moved to Rosemount, and the Ashtons and the Johnstons were all from down that little part of town. I don't really know why that particular part of town was such a hotbed for gangsters, but there were those guys and many others, just out of control bandits left and right from that area. So the Maguires were, I think they started off as I should really go into a bit of background. The mafia during this time was sort of congealing as a fairly significant force. And firstly, you had the king of the gangsters was a Jewish guy named Harry Davis, who was killed on Stanley Street. And his two guards, Frank Pritula and Johnny Greco, became sort of like the de facto bosses of Montreal crime for a while. And Pritula sort of went nuts and was never found again. But basically, he started a feud with somebody. Police came to his house. His wife sort of opened the safe for the police foolishly. And so they basically had all of the secrets of the gang. So this probably didn't really bode well for him. And he was never seen again. Presumably his partner, Johnny Greco, put him in a cement shoes or something like that. But the thing that Pritula did, according to the book that was written about the West End gang, there's a book out there, which is not a bad book, Darcy O'Connor's book. And he argues that the West End gang, the first mention of this term was used in connection with Pritula, who, what he did is he just got a whole bunch of black boxers who from the downtown area to be strong men for him, and they would wreck up places or whatever he ordered them to do. So that was the first mention in the press of this term, the West End gang. So I don't necessarily agree with that, but it's interesting to note that the boxers and stuff that have been always avidly recruited by these groups, and that was, to have some sort of insane person protecting you is always like a key element in these scenarios, and without that is a big problem. So yeah, so you had a whole bunch of boxers like Charlie Chase, Lionel Deere. They were mentioned sporadically in the newspapers. There was actually one of them, believe it or not, who was causing a bit of trouble. And then he moved off to Los Angeles and became a prominent actor. This young black guy, he was on Star Trek. Anyway, I'm forgetting his name right now, but it's amazing to see that some of these people actually did quite well. The contrast would be like Charlie Chase, who was just, he's a great boxer, but he kept on getting thrown in jail. And then his other friend there, whose name I'm forgetting, became like quite an actor, well-known actor in Hollywood. So, the roll of the dice of our fate is kind of like so odd and unpredictable sometimes. It's quite amazing. But anyway, so like the reason I'm calling my book "You Want In, You're In" is because that's what I've done a lot of interviews with people from that whole circle, the gang, and that's what he told me the recruitment process was, which is basically they just take anybody, and yet the amazing thing about the West End gang throughout the ages. I'm sort of jumping ahead now because I'm talking about a guy from the 80s and 90s who they were able to more or less fly under the radar. It's quite insane that they didn't get nailed more often, but they were able to infiltrate police more than police will infiltrated them. But I'll come back to that in a second. So then the next real step of the stage of the West End gang sort of became the 1960s, when you had a whole bunch of really savage characters, most notably the trio of James MacDonald and Jimmy Collins and McNally. So Collins, McNally, MacDonald were this very fearsome, crazy bunch of robbers. Whatever they would do, they would just rob trucks, they would do all sorts of stuff. But MacDonald, of the three, was the most insane of the three, for sure. For example, he had an argument at a place called Bud's on Stanley Street where they were hanging around, and he went into the kitchen and cut somebody's fingers off with a knife. He grabbed a knife, chopped someone's fingers off, and I think the guy who lost the fingers was an Italian guy, and the local mafia boss was really not happy about that. I think it was Johnny Greco again. So we're talking about Collins, McNally, and MacDonald, who were just like wreaking havoc. Collins, for example, he was on Chamonix in St. Catherine where he was living, and he killed a guy, and he managed to get acquitted for some reason, or short sentence or something. And so McNally, for his part, was actually quite a successful businessman. And around 1968, it all fell apart. We had McNally was found dead, and of course it was MacDonald who did it. And why did he do it? Well, there's an interesting sort of crime commission testimony from a guy named Aboud, who kind of gave insights into this, and it's in the papers. Like, Aboud was talking quite interesting details about the West End gang. He was explaining why there was this feud going on, and he actually had some like, for some of his other stuff what he said was quite fascinating. Like, for example, he said that there's a goalie in the NHL named Glenn Hall who actually threw a game for gamblers, and Glenn Hall is still alive. He was actually having a great season that year. But that sort of revelation was a shock. Even today, it's shocking to think that the underworld was possibly throwing hockey games, NHL hockey games. So back to the other story about the McNally, Collins, and MacDonald trio. It's just a fascinating sociological experiment that I guess they were competing to be the most vicious, and MacDonald became the most vicious. He went on, my research has concluded that he went on I have several sources for this. He went into a parking lot, and because he was unhappy that his keys weren't there, or put some other place a couple blocks down, he actually got the attendant, to go on his knees. He shot him dead, just like that, like an execution. And not only did he do this incredibly pointless and heartless act, but he boasted about it to everybody else. So he was just going around town, people were like, this guy's a scary psycho, and he was just kind of being grumpy, and nobody knew how to deal with MacDonald. So for example, he befriended Jackie McLaughlin, and I'll explain who Jackie McLaughlin is in a few seconds. But the fact is that Jackie McLaughlin and MacDonald were like two insane, ruthless killers. And there's an interesting book written by a guy named Peter McAllister called Dexter, which is a fictionalized version of his life in the West End gang, and it actually refers to this incident where he saw MacDonald and McLaughlin talking together, and he was so disturbed because he hated MacDonald and he liked Jackie McLaughlin, and he said that he pulled Jackie McLaughlin away from MacDonald. He said, don't hang around that guy. So what happened is, in spite of MacDonald being quite unpopular with the rest of the gang, he actually was part of a crew that stole a cigarette truck, and sort of one of the other people involved in that was Billy the Bishop Johnston. It's an interesting family, of course, one of the dominant families of the West End gang history, the Johnston brothers. But of course, they're a little bit more discreet, so they're quite intelligent people. And I think they're all dead now, except for the hockey goalie, Eddie Johnston, who's still alive. but the rest of them have all passed away, but they definitely left their mark. So here I am rambling. Let me get back to the story. So what happened to MacDonald is that he was accruing a whole lot of dangerous enemies, and he was sitting in a bar on Guy Street called the Cat's Den, and two guys came in and just shot him dead with machine guns, and a couple of people got injured in that. So that was a momentous occasion in the demise of that dominant trio, the Collins, McNally, McDonald trio. And a few weeks later, the last of the three, as we know, McNally had already been killed with his girlfriend on the West Island. And then McDonald was killed on Guy Street in that bar. And then Collins, who was actually quite tall, was sitting in a bar on St. Catherine near the Forum, and he was shot dead in front of people and nobody saw a thing. So that era of the West End gang, that insanely brutal era, was over. But what happened later is some of the people from that time kind of became more prominent. And now this is where I start talking about Dooney Ryan, who was raised on the plateau with a single mother, and he was just doing this sort of crime and that sort of crime. And he went down to Boston with a crew and got caught doing a bank robbery there. People often wonder whether there's a big connection between Montreal and Boston in terms of the Irish and crime groups. And it's not really clear whether there was or not. Some people will argue that there was, but there's not much evidence. So it does appear, though, that the Boston people recruited these Montreal bandits to do some of these robberies in Boston, and Dooney Ryan was caught and put in jail. So Dooney Ryan, he would later emerge as the most charismatic and an interesting leader of the entire history of the West End gang. But that's largely due to different circumstances, which I'll explain in a moment. So at this point, you had the demise of that first group. And meanwhile, the aforementioned Jackie McLaughlin was going around and doing a bunch of extortions. He'd walk up and down St. Catherine Street into bars and say, "Give me money." So there was a very interesting place called the Little Cozy, and that was somewhere on St. Catherine Street, just east of the Forum. And so this bar was where they were all hanging out and planning murders and robberies and stuff. The Little Cozy, it's obviously long gone, but a lot of stories from there. So Jackie McLaughlin went up to the owner. It had changed names by this point, and he just sort of said, "Well, give me some money." And for some reason, this woman who owned the bar said, "No, I'm not giving you any money. Go away." And maybe she wasn't scared of Jackie, so she called the police, and they arrested him. So Jackie McLaughlin was put into jail. So this woman who ran that bar was a sort of a hero insofar as she actually stood up to this bandit running an extortion ring. So we had a situation where some of the talent that was to emerge later in the 1970s and 80s was in jail behind bars. So what happened is eventually, after only a fraction of his sentence, Dooney Ryan was sent back to Montreal. And it wasn't really clear to me why he served so little of his time, but he was back on the scene by the early 1970s and looking for things to do. And of course, Jackie McLaughlin came out on the streets as well. So what happened is Dooney Ryan would go to a bar called Smitty's on Sherbrooke and Cavendish, the big 20-story tower that's there now. Well, there's a gym in there now, and that's where Smitty's was. And it was a very interesting place because the police actually had a wiretap. Montreal police had a wiretap on Smitty's, and I had a friend who actually got the transcript of all of those wiretaps of all these criminals talking, and he said it was quite a hoot. Unfortunately, he misplaced it. Now I don't know how to get another copy of it, but I would love to read those wiretaps because you'd get for example, Dooney Ryan would pick up the phone and start talking about this deal or that deal. And I know a woman who was working as a waitress there, so I got a lot of sort of sense of this bar Smitty's and its importance. One of the Sullivan brothers was a co-owner, and this was a place with a lot of famous for fist fights. Smitty himself was an old time doorman Tim Burke actually wrote an interview with him about old time fighting in bars. And it was sort of a crazy kind of thing to think about. But, you know, these bar brawls was a sort of like a major component of the whole West End gang experience. Who was the toughest and who was so one of the toughest was one of the Sullivan brothers. I think it was Tommy, but I'd have to check. And he, the bar eventually closed in 1974, and Tommy Sullivan went to Ontario, and he was being abusive with his wife, and his son objected, and he shot his father. So Tommy Sullivan was shot dead in his home by his son. So that was just one of the, apparently his funeral was one of the largest attended in all of NDG history. So we had to shift from Smitty's to the new headquarters, which was called the Cavalier. Now, the Cavalier is on St. James Street West. If you know NDG, it would be across from the Super C grocery store now. So it's still a motel, but it doesn't have a bar. It had a bar back in those days, and it was quite full. So this became the place for Dooney Ryan and his henchmen to hang around. And things really started to change, because we had a period where Dooney Ryan would be just nickel and dime. He didn't know how to make money, and he put money into some heroin deal, and it didn't work. He lost money on it. I mean, back at that point, the gang was funding itself off of a lot of, I haven't even mentioned the Maddox brothers yet, and they were all about the truck hijackings. I should explain that when I say the truck hijackings, they didn't actually stop a truck. The trucks were always parked somewhere. So this is something I think it should be made clear, that the truck theft thing, which was huge, they almost never, if ever at all, actually pulled the driver out like you see in movies. They just got keys to a truck and drove off with it. So that was the West End gang wasn't rich. They were doing a hodgepodge of these little deals, bank robberies, this, that, and the other. So what happened by the mid 70s is everything changed in one development, and that was cocaine. So cocaine became a huge deal. It was just transformed everything by 180 degrees. It was night and day. So people like Dooney Ryan suddenly had a very, very lucrative business. They were just sitting around doing very little and trying not to get arrested. And suddenly they were the robber barons. They were just huge. They had so much money. So Dooney Ryan himself became the focus of this whole gang, because his character was not really much of a leader. They called him Mother because he was so chatty and asked people how you doing and all that stuff. So people liked him. He was considered very charismatic, and his sources of a cocaine included a South American guy who would bring his. I actually interviewed this guy many times. He's currently in a prison in Peru, and somehow he was able to get Wi-Fi connection, and he would tell me all about the inner workings of the Dooney Ryan and what drove him. So this South American, whose name I'm forgetting, but he had a very complicated, long. His father was a diplomat, so he was able to get diplomatic pouches full of cocaine brought here without getting checked at the border. So that was one of the sources of the cocaine that came into Montreal. And mid 70s, you had a growing market for cocaine, but it obviously just kept on exploding. It became a larger demand. So if anybody would ever put their mind to this question, which has really been bothering me, is like, why wasn't there cocaine earlier? I mean, we had a cocaine in the 1880s to up to 1919 or so when it was outlawed. But it seems amazing to me that if you could turn back time and you wanted to be a super rich gangster in 1950 or 60, obvious thing would be to just get cocaine into town, because it just leaves me baffled as to why this wasn't a factor earlier on, because there's unlimited demand for it, but for some reason it wasn't really. If you look in the old newspapers, cocaine was not even mentioned in articles for like 50 years. There's like one mention of it in Al Palmer's book. Al Palmer, by the way, was an amazing kind of journalist in Montreal, very colorful, sort of like Nick Offermar, but 100 times better. He was back in the 50s and stuff, and he actually wrote a little book talking about cocaine. Anyway, so I could go on all day, but I'll try to get to the point here. So Dooney Ryan was the ascendant big guy, and there was some police pressure, but there was surprisingly little effective police ability to take the gang down. Some of these guys were like quite outspoken. There was this one guy I have a chapter on called Dickie Lavoie, who would come to bars and say things like, "I smattered his brain all over the wall." He would be boasting all the time about the murders he committed, and yet nobody even knew of this guy. The police, the whole gang loved Dickie Lavoie. He'd spent his whole life in prison in the States. But eventually what happened, the short version is, Dooney Ryan became wealthier and wealthier, and he relied on this guy, Jackie McLaughlin, to be his protection. And Jackie was quite effective. He would be killing people left, right, and center. But Jackie kind of went more and more crazy. He had an injury and started on medication, and he just started killing the wrong people. So what happened is he eventually was sort of sent to New Brunswick to get out of the way. And that left Dooney Ryan vulnerable to attack. And in November 1984, Dooney was at Nidalo's when a few guys came and shot him dead. So that was kind of seen as the rise and fall of the West End gang. Of course, you've had loads of other things happening since, but when they tell that story, they usually kind of really focus in on the killing of Dooney Ryan. And it's, to this day, it's not exactly clear who killed them. And I have a whole lot of research and theories about that, but I'll save that for another time.
Thanks very much, Kristian. Right away, I have a couple of questions, which I guess is a little bit after the time that you've come up to. Whatever happened to Davy Hilton and his family? Talking about boxers.
Well, the Hiltons, they were recruited by the the Italian mob. So I think Davy became a protector for Rizzuto. I've spoken to Davy Hilton many times. He was very close to Frank Catroni. So I don't know what he actually did with them, but the other boys were just a little bit out of control. So they ended up in jail on various things. They'd start drinking, and then they'd, of course, do crazy robberies, but they were not really affiliated in any sort. Nobody was really affiliated in an official sense, but they were kind of, I think we can most profitably look at the Hiltons as these symbols of what they could be. They people took a lot of pride in the boxing skills of those guys. They saw themselves in them, and it was a shame that they, of course, fell apart because people really identified with them. But the whole thing turned to stuff. But they were never really involved in any organized way with the bank heists or all of these other things.
Okay. And the last one is Tony Maggi used to live across the street from his mother. And we used to see big Suburbans and that kind of thing parked around the place. At first we thought it was RCMP, and then we realized that it was Maggi's guards. He died, but he's been dead 4 years now, I guess. But he was more closely associated directly with Mafia than with the West End gang. Is that correct?
Yeah, and there's, of course, there was a sort of the black street gang scene that he was somehow affiliated with. There was a guy named Joseph, what's his name, Carmen, and Tony Maggi survived a shooting by this guy Joseph, and then suddenly Joseph was, well, I don't know if actually Joseph tried to kill him, but that's one version of it. And then Joseph was suddenly working for Tony Maggi. So it's all very confused as to what the inner workings were with Tony Maggi and what he was doing. But it's a very dramatic story as well. But yeah, of course, that's more Mafia than anything else.
Questions? Anybody else? Because I've got lots of them. Yeah, I guess I remember the days of down on St. Jacques Street, and there was a bar down there, a Western bar, Pigs. And if you wanted to look for a fight, if you wanted to go dancing and have country music, it was a great place. But invariably, you wanted to be out of there before 11 o'clock, before the rough guys came in.
Yeah, there was, I think, two major incidents at Pigs. There was, of course, a motel behind it, and a Dickie Lavoie actually lived across the street, which was another bar. I think the Old Inn or whatever it was called, and that was up across the street. But Pigs, John Slavy actually was there, and he shot at police, and he narrowly missed them. John Slavy was an interesting character as well. I've got a big chapter on him. I know his widow or his girlfriend from the time, and police really didn't like that John Slavy shooting at them, and they went to his home and shot him dead in the parking lot on Benny and Sherbrooke, and there was a gun next to him, and they claimed that he held the gun, but it was quite unlikely that he actually did that. John Slavy actually killed a cop earlier in a Simpsons robbery downtown several years earlier and got away with it. So Slavy was definitely one of those guys at Pigs. And yeah, there's a few other stories at Pigs. Another guy was he had double-crossed a guy named Billy Brown, I believe. He double-crossed some of his other guy in the West End gang, and they shot him dead after he left. So that was another gang member. And the third Peg story I would say was sort of quite interesting. Was there was a really heartless rape of these two young women who went in there, and they were sort of like peripheral characters on the West End gang. So one of the unfortunate things with this gang is that there was some practice, a culture of very terrifying sexual assault, and there, it wasn't everybody, but there was a few stories that really make your skin crawl. So it's really not, we shouldn't lionize any of these people. Not all of them did it, but it was enough to make you think that that's not a very nice thing that they're doing.
What's the dynamic that lets you be able to speak to all these people and get all these stories without being offed?
Well, I think the idea would be that when you kind of know a subject and then you're trying to phone someone and ask them about it, they see it more as a swap of information. So I have there's this character named anyway, the guy out in Vancouver whose ex-mistress I've spoken to, and she gave me so many amazing stories. And I guess they like to tell their stories, but they also probably like to tell their stories to someone who kind of understands the whole the whole situation. Like, for example, Dickie Lavoie had a beautiful young girlfriend about 30 years younger than him, and she would actually actively drive him around to his robberies and stuff. So she was very much complicit in the thing, and she talked to me quite openly about the whole thing. In fact, he murdered a guy just right in front of her, and she covered it up for him. She didn't tell me that, but I know that's the case. So it's amazing that people tell you these stories, and I thank them for it, because they're worth telling. They're worth knowing.
These people, are they happy with how their lives turned out or what they did?
Well, I think we always have to keep in context the reality of those years. And I don't think all of them can really explain that. Like, for example, the one who was going out with Dickie Lavoie, she didn't really, she didn't understand. In fact, there's another woman from who's living out west now, and she actually wrote a novel. No, I'm sorry, a book of her life. And she was in love with just a thug who was just, doing all sorts of robberies, involved in a kidnapping, and she took part in the kidnapping and everything. And she wrote quite shameless, no shame at all. She wrote about her part in the whole thing and how she was in love with this guy and he was the love of her life. So there was an element probably back then of women wanting the big scary guy for protection, because the whole world was a bit rougher then. So if you had the roughest of the rough people, I'm just imagining how they saw it in their eyes anyway. So like I said, I think they all kind of see it within the context of the time. But that particular one I mentioned, who's out west, has said that she's very much happy to be away from the Montreal scene.
The Bonnie and Clyde syndrome, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, listen, thank you very, very much. I remember the last time that you spoke to us, and I think you did a pretty good job of not repeating. But there's so many stories, and it's sometimes they're hard to believe, but I get a big kick out of them because I'm an NDG boy, and So many of the names are familiar. I wish I'd known them better. But thank you very, very much for your time, and I'm sure we'll be calling you up and getting you back here another time before too long. And best of luck with your book.
Much appreciated.
Let us know when it comes out.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.